So a few weeks ago, when we started Lent, we started this series called Prototype, right? And the idea behind this whole thing is that here's the schools that you would, if you were a Jewish kid growing up in Israel in the first century, you'd first go to the school, and the school would be called Bet Sefer, right? That Bet Sefer, from 6 years old to 10 years old, you'd learn the first 5 books of the Bible, first 5 books of Moses. If that was enough school for you, they would say, go learn the trade of your father, and you'd be dismissed and you go back home. If you were the best of the best, you'd go on to Bet Talmud, and from 10 years old to 15 years old, you'd learn the entire rest of the Bible, you'd memorize the whole thing. And then if you were the best of the best, if you weren't, you'd go learn the trade of your father. If you were the best of the best of the best, you'd be invited to find a rabbi. And that was Bet Midrash. And if you're part of the school of Bet Midrash, the goal was to become like your rabbi, right? You'd find a rabbi and not just learn the Bible from him, but learn how to live from him. And so as we're in this season of Lent, we're in this, again, series called Prototype, we're in Bet Midrash. We're in this place of just watching a rabbi, watching Jesus and saying, okay, how does he do these things? You know, there's this moment in the gospel, not today's gospel, but a moment in the gospel when Jesus says, come to me. Basically, he says, all you who are labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, that phrase, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, is very, really, really important. I mean, not only because Jesus said it, but also because of the image that it gives. What is a yoke? Well, a yoke is this, farming implement. It's made of wood or of metal of some sort, and it goes around the shoulders of a beast of burden. And there's such a thing as a single yoke, right? There's the one where just here you have one cow or something, you put that yoke around that cow's shoulders. But most oftentimes, there would be a dual yoke. And so you'd have one beast of burden that would have its head through the yoke, and another beast of burden that would have its head through the adjoining, the next yoke. When Jesus is telling us, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, one of the things he could be saying is, yep, do what I'm doing, right? Work the way I'm working, 100%. Yes, absolutely, that's what it is to follow the rabbi. But an aspect of that is, here's Jesus with his head through this yoke. He's not saying, put your head in the yoke instead of me, but with me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. So here's Jesus, picture this, with his head through the yoke, and he's inviting us to put our heads in that adjoining yoke. The invitation here is to look at the world the way I look at the world. Like Jesus is inviting us to have his perspective, to see things the way he sees things. Again, this is, remember, the whole goal of being in Bet Midrash is to not just know what your rabbi knows, also to do what your rabbi does, to see how your rabbi sees, to be like your rabbi. This is the imitation of Christ. This is why we're doing this whole Lent, based off of this command we have to be imitators of Christ. And we do that in many ways by seeing the way Jesus sees. Last week, it was, how does Jesus see the Father? How does he see himself? He's one who's been claimed by the Father. And this weekend, we get to ask the question, how does Jesus see others? So if Jesus has invited us, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Okay, how does he see his Father? How does he see this world? How does he see other people? And we have this incredible story today of Jesus with this woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. And it's so important, I think, to understand this, because if we're going to look at others the way Jesus wants us to look at others, if we're going to take his yoke upon us and see the way he sees, if we're going to become like him, we're going to be imitators of Jesus, we have to know more about the story. Maybe you know some of these things already, these elements. Here's Jesus, and he gets to the well. The disciples leave him, they go into town to get some food. Now, here's the interesting thing about Jews and Samaritans is they do not get along. In fact, we have this idea of the Good Samaritan. It's like, that's like a compliment to somebody. There was a guy in seminary with me, he was a couple years ahead of me. He used to do a study abroad in Jerusalem program. And at one point he was living in Israel for this, 3 months. And he came back and he told this story. He said, at one point, there's this woman in a shop, and she was helping him out with something, and one of his buddies came up and said, hey, do you need any help? He's like, oh, no, this Good Samaritan helped me out. And this woman, who's a Jewish woman, got so mad. She was so incredibly offended. He meant it as a compliment by calling her a Good Samaritan. She took it as a massive offense. I'm not a Samaritan. I am a Jewish woman who worships the Lord God. This is a people who did not get along. And here's Jesus. Now, most Jews, if they were going from the north of Israel to Judea, to Jerusalem, they would go days out of the way to avoid going through Samaria. But here's Jesus walking through Samaria. Here's a Samaritan woman. So first of all, the fact that he's talking with Samaritan in the first place is pushing the boundaries. Then he's talking with a woman. Now, there are stories that abound in Judaism about how a Jewish man would not talk to any woman who is not his direct relative in public. In fact, there are stories of, back in the first century, of Jewish men who wouldn't even talk with their own family in public. They wouldn't talk to their own daughter in public or their own wife in public. There is this sense of propriety, right? So here's this Samaritan who don't talk to Samaritans, don't have anything to do with Samaritans. John gives a little allusion to that. Here's a woman that Jesus should not be talking to, but here's the ultimate point, is that here's a woman who is coming to the well at noon. Now, if you're coming to a well at noon, either you've planned your day really, really poorly, or there's a reason why you have to come at noon. Because the time to draw water is in the morning. The time to draw water is in the cool of the day or the cool of the evening. You would not draw water because it is cumbersome to carry a massive bucket or cistern, or to get a bucket from the cistern back to the city in the middle of the day where it's blazing hot. So either she planned this poorly or there's a reason. And we learned that there's a reason. That all the other women, they would come to the cistern in the morning. That's when they would get their water. That's when they'd have their time with friends, time with family, time with, other sisters. But this woman was not welcomed there. We find out why. We find out because she has a broken story. She hasn't just been married she's been married 5 times, and the man she's with right now is not even her husband. So you have this triple dilemma here, where here's this person who shouldn't be talked to because she's a Samaritan, she's part of this one group. She's a woman, so propriety would say she shouldn't be talked to. And she also has a broken story. So Jesus shouldn't talk to her. But what does Jesus do? What does our rabbi do? What does our prototype do? He doesn't do what we would do. I think a lot of times we see someone's group. The 2 things we do typically is we see someone's group or we see someone's shame. All the time. We do this even we don't even want to. I do this when I don't even want to. I see someone's group. If you get mad at someone, a little annoyed at someone, all of a sudden, the easiest thing in the world is to classify them, right? The easiest thing in the world is to put them into a group. Driving along the road, this is where I get my most anger out. So driving along the road, someone's slow driving in the left lane and they're in a truck. I'm like, truck drivers, what the heck? Or someone's driving in the left lane and they're driving a Tesla. Tesla drivers, I don't know. Or people driving in the left lane and they have their dog on their lap. People drive their dogs on their laps. Those people are stupid. We can easily group people. That's what we tend to do. To identify people by their group. And yet, what does Jesus reveal? Jesus reveals that ultimately, he cares about the person, not the group that the person belongs to. Now, of course, our group is important. Psychologists have demonstrated this, that at some point we need to be part of a group. We need to be part of a group and know that we're accepted. We know that we belong. That is absolutely necessary for proper human development, to know that you're part of a group and you're wanted there, like a family. But for proper human development, at some point, I have to differentiate myself from that group. I have to recognize, this is the remarkable discovery of Jesus, the revelation of Jesus in the Gospels. The Judeo-Christianity not only reveals that we need to be part of a group, that's incredible, but that's known around the world. Almost every people knows that we need to be part of a group. What Jesus reveals is that we also need to discover the fact that we are an individual in the midst of the group. And the individual is even more important than the group. That Jesus, how he sees people, is he sees the person, not the group. And this image, this vision has transformed the world. Jesus sees the person and not the group. The impact this has made on our world is astounding. So, in the 18th century, there was a man in England. His name was William Wilberforce. You might know the name William Wilberforce. At one point, he was the youngest person ever to be elected to British Parliament, and he was kind of a waste of space in some ways. He was just kind of a waste of a life. He got that place because he was a really smart guy. He was really driven, but also he was kind of in the right position. At one point, after serving in Parliament for a little while, he went on a trip and he took a pilgrimage through Europe to Rome. He became a Christian on that pilgrimage. On that trip, he became a Christian. He came back to England, and he asked the question. He was asking himself the question, and in prayer, asking God the question, okay, now what do I do? Because, God, I realize this parliament is not for, like, they're not good people there. And so I want to be a good person. I want to be a saint. I want to be holy. Should I stay in parliament or not? So he took a lot of time, and he just prayed and asked God's discernment. What should I do? And after this prayer, many, many weeks, he had two resolutions. He said he's going to stay in parliament, and what he was going to devote his life to was to two things. One was the reform of morals in England, and the second was the abolition of the British or European slave trade. Now we might hear the second one like, yeah, all right, abolition of the European slave trade. And the first one, we think, well, the reform of morals, are you sure? Well, what was happening at the time of 18th century England is it was not a good place. If you think like, oh, that was a puritanical time, no, it was the opposite of a puritanical time. It was the kind of time where when he meant by reform of morals is basically reform of culture. In that age, child labor was commonly accepted. Kids working in factories at 4 years old. William Wilberforce said that's not right. Just to lump poor people together and say they have to serve this way, that's not right. He saw the person. At that time, alcoholism was rampant across the country. In fact, there were minutes where it talks about whole sessions of parliament where everyone in parliament was completely drunk as they were serving, quote unquote, serving in parliament. Alcoholism was rampant. And yeah, you could group people together, say just a bunch of drunks. But because William Wilberforce had taken the yoke of Jesus upon him, he saw the person, not the group. At that time, the dehumanizing of people was massive. At one point, they had bear baiting, basically, where they would either pit a bear against a bunch of dogs and just watch who survives, fight to the death. Then they would have, when they got bored with that, they would have public executions. Here's a criminal who's going to get executed. It's not enough for me to watch a bear get killed or tortured to death by these dogs. I'm going to watch a human being get killed. And then after that, they would have public dissections of human bodies. This is like the culture that he's living in. In fact, not only that, prostitution in London was rampant. It was said at one point that 1 out of every 4 single women in London was a prostitute, and the average age was 16 years old. So when William Wilberforce took on the yoke of Jesus and began to see like his rabbi, right, to see like Jesus saw, he learned that, no, we have to see the person, not the group. And then when it came to the British slave trade, right, exactly the same kind of thing, is here are these people who are being shipped across the ocean from Africa to Europe or to America. He said, no, these are individuals, not just a group of people. And this is the massive and radical distinction that seeing like Jesus sees, to be like our prototype, has transformed the world. 2 weeks before William Wilberforce died, British Parliament passed a bill abolishing the British slave trade. Because why? Because this one individual was willing to see the way Jesus sees. The way Jesus sees this Samaritan woman. He saw the person and not the group. And this is our invitation as well. In everyone we're dealing with, to not say, oh, you're one of those people. Just because I know this one thing about you means I know you. That's false. To see the way Jesus sees means I see the person, not the group. But also, to see the way Jesus sees means I see the person, not the shame. Because here's this woman she's disqualified. I mean, she's even disqualified from her own people. She's disqualified as a Samaritan. She's disqualified as the women in her own culture. In her own group, she's disqualified. Why? Because too often we define a person, we label a person by their shame. We call a person by their shame. But Jesus, he knows her shame. I mean, he even tells her, you've been married 5 times. I already know this. The one you're with is not your husband. He knows her shame, but he calls her by her name. This is the massive distinction, massive difference between the way a Christian has to look at the world. We see the person, not their shame. We don't always do that. In fact, we probably fail more often than not. But when we do it, it's incredible. Like when we actually do succeed in this, it is remarkable. It can actually change people's lives. There's a story I always share whenever we talk about the theology of the body. There's a story that I heard Christopher West once share back in the day. It's about a bishop named Bishop Nonus. And the story is that at one point, Bishop Nonus, this is way back in the first centuries of Christianity, Bishop Nonus is walking out of a church, and he's walking out with a bunch of other bishops. And as he and these other bishops are walking out of this church, in that exact moment, there's a woman who's crossing the street right in front of them. And it's a well-known prostitute in that town. And she, as I always say, is like dressed for work. So basically her shame is on display. And the bishop who's standing next to Bishop Nonus, he immediately sees, oh, there's a prostitute there. He looks away. And because he's averting his eyes, right? He's protecting his own sense of chastity, his own sense of purity. He doesn't want to use this woman. And so he looks away. And then he notices the bishop next to him, Bishop Nonus, is actually not looking away. He's actually staring directly at this woman as she's walking by. And he corrects him. He scolds him. He says, Bishop, what are you doing? Avert your eyes. And as Bishop Nonus turns to his brother bishop and looks at him, there are tears in his eyes. And he says the words, he says, what a tragedy it is that such beauty has been used by the lusts of men. What a tragedy it is that such beauty has been sold to the lusts of men. Because he saw this woman walk by, but he saw her, not her shame. He saw her, not her sin. He did not find her by her story. He just saw her. And to be able to look that way, right? The other bishop, he'd looked away. He had to look away. Sometimes we all have to look away in that sense that, okay, if I don't, I'll be tempted to use this person because that's our broken hearts. But that's not the point. The point is to have the yoke of Jesus, right? To be like our rabbi, to be in this bet midrash where we actually see the person and not the shame. Now, the story goes on that the woman, the prostitute, she actually noticed that a bunch of bishops walked out and one of them stared at her. But the way he stared at her, the way he looked at her, she recognized was different than the way any other man has ever stared at her before. And so she actually made some inquiries and asked the question, who was this person? Who was this bishop? Found out that was Bishop Nonus, and she went to visit him. In that visit, he told her about Jesus Christ and how Jesus loves her, that Jesus knows her name. He calls her by her name, even though he knows her shame. That he could give her new life, that she became a Christian. In fact, she didn't just become a Christian. Her name is Pelagia, and she's now known in the church as Saint Pelagia, this woman who was seen by another bishop, Saint Bishop Nonus, who had looked at her the way Jesus looked at the woman at the well. He looked at her the way that we're supposed to look at every person. How does Jesus look at people? He sees the person, not their group. He sees the person and not their shame. And this is our invitation, is to fight against that temptation to group someone together, to fight the temptation to say, I know everything I need to know about you. I know your worst moment. How often do we define someone by their worst choices? How often do we define someone by the worst thing they've done? As opposed to being like Jesus, who says, I know the story, but I see you. This is what it is to be in Bet Midrash. This is what it is to let Jesus be our prototype. And this is the last thing. Back in here in the Diocese of Duluth, we had a bishop when I was growing up. We pray for him at every Mass. Pray for Bishop Brahm, our bishop. At one point, after Bishop Brahm left Duluth, he went to become the Bishop of San Diego. And a friend of mine, he writes a bunch of books. His name is Jason Everett. Jason Everett, at one point, he was talking about his Bishop Brahm. And I was like, wait, no, you mean my Bishop Brahm? And he's like, well, our Bishop Brahm. He recounted the story. It's actually, he wrote about it in his book about John Paul II, His Five Loves. At one point, Bishop Brahm, when he became the Diocese of Duluth, he had to go on a visit to the Holy Father, the Pope John Paul II, who had named him bishop. And he walks into a pretty big day, and you get to meet the Pope. And he walks into the Pope's office, and he says, Holy Father, it's an honor to meet you. And John Paul II stands up, and he comes across his desk, and he says, no, Bishop Brahm, we've met before. It's good to see you again. He's like, no, Holy Father, I'm so sorry, but we've never met before. I remember meeting you. I remember meeting the Pope. He's like, no, we've met before. And Bishop Brahm is like, I'm really sorry. You must have me confused with someone else. Holy Father, we've never met. And John Paul II says, well, no, we have. This is the second time we've met. And Bishop Brahm doubles down. It's like, no, we haven't met. Anyways, John Paul lets it go. They have the rest of their meeting. At the end of the meeting,